You're handsome, you know that? The words landed in the quiet garage like a loose bolt hitting concrete, small but loud enough to stop everything. Malik Carter froze halfway down the aluminum ladder, one hand still gripping a screwdriver, the other steadying the old garage light he had just finished rewiring. Above him, the new LED bulb flickered once, then settled into a warm amber glow, humming softly against the cool afternoon air. For a moment, the only sounds were the faint buzz of electricity and the distant whir of sprinklers watering a perfectly trimmed lawn somewhere across the quiet suburban street. Malik blinked, certain he must have misheard. Compliments from customers were not unusual, but they were usually about the work. Good job. Fast service. Appreciate you coming out. Not that. Slowly he climbed down the last 2 rungs of the ladder and set both boots on the smooth concrete floor of the 3-car garage. The place smelled faintly of fresh paint and motor oil, the kind of garage that held more luxury than most living rooms. A sleek black SUV sat parked under recessed ceiling lights, its paint reflecting the new fixture Malik had just installed. He wiped his hands on the worn cotton rag hanging from his tool belt and turned toward the doorway. Evelyn Hayes stood there, barefoot on the cool tile leading into the house, one shoulder resting lightly against the frame like she had been watching him for a while. She wore a soft blue dress that moved slightly with the breeze drifting in through the open side door, and her expression was calm, almost curious, as if she had simply stated a fact instead of something that could make a man stop breathing for half a second. Malik cleared his throat, the way a man does when he needs a second to catch up with a moment. Thank you, ma'am, he said, careful, respectful, his voice carrying the steady politeness he used with every client. Light should be good now. Wiring was loose in the junction box. Probably been flickering a while. Evelyn didn't move right away. Instead, she glanced up at the bright fixture above them, watching the glow spread across the polished floor like liquid gold. It has, she said softly. For weeks. Then her eyes returned to him, studying his face with an openness Malik wasn't used to seeing. From people who lived behind gates and security cameras. But that's not what I meant. Malik shifted his weight slightly, the rubber soles of his boots squeaking against the floor. He had worked in houses like this before. Houses big enough that voices echoed down hallways, and the refrigerators probably cost more than his pickup truck. But he had learned early that the safest place for a man like him was the narrow line between friendly and invisible. Do the work well. Be respectful. Leave no reason for anyone to question why you were there. Compliments about appearance crossed that line into a place he preferred not to stand. He picked up his toolbox from the floor and snapped the metal latches closed with a soft click. Garage lights pulling about 10 watts now, he added, keeping the conversation on safe ground. Should last you 10 years easy. Evelyn smiled faintly at that, like she appreciated the effort even if she wasn't following him there. 10 years, she repeated, glancing again at the light, then back at him. That's longer than most things last around here. The sentence hung in the air, not sad exactly, but heavier than the quiet garage seemed built to hold. Malik lifted the toolbox handle and took a step toward the driveway where his old white work truck sat parked beneath the late afternoon sun. The truck looked small compared to the wide concrete driveway and tall oak trees framing the property, but it was clean, dependable, and paid for, which mattered more to him than how it looked next to a luxury SUV. As he reached the open garage door, Evelyn's voice followed him again, gentle but clear. Do you always leave this fast after fixing something? Malik paused, turning just enough to look back at her over his shoulder. The sunlight behind him cast long shadows across the garage floor, and for a brief moment the warm glow from the new light above mixed with the golden light of the setting sun. Usually, he said with a small shrug. Evelyn took a slow step forward, the quiet tap of her bare foot on the tile echoing faintly in the wide space. That's a shame, she said thoughtfully. Malik raised an eyebrow, puzzled despite himself. Why's that? Evelyn met his eyes without hesitation, her voice calm, almost playful, but still sincere enough to make the moment feel real. Because, she said softly, most people who come here only fix the problem they're paid for. Malik didn't answer right away. The breeze shifted through the open garage, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and distant rain. He stood there with his toolbox in hand, unsure why a simple house call suddenly felt like the first move in a story he didn't quite understand yet. Malik Carter did not move for several seconds. The breeze drifting through the open garage door brushed lightly against his shirt, carrying the faint smell of warm asphalt and cut grass from the long driveway outside. Somewhere down the quiet suburban street, a lawn mower hummed in the distance, steady and ordinary, the kind of sound that usually helped him remember exactly where he stood in the world. Work done. Tools packed. Job complete. But this moment did not move the way his workdays usually did. Evelyn Hayes stood a few feet away now, no longer leaning on the doorway. The soft light from the newly installed fixture stretched across the garage ceiling and reflected in the polished hood of the black SUV beside them. It also caught the quiet curiosity in her eyes, the kind that made Malik feel like he was being seen in a way he had not expected when he knocked on the door an hour earlier carrying a toolbox and a ladder. He shifted the weight of the toolbox in his hand, the metal handle cool against his palm. Most people only need the light fixed, he said after a moment, his voice calm and careful. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him with a calm patience that felt unusual in a house this large. "And you think that is the only thing you fixed today?" she asked. Malik almost smiled at that, but it was the kind of smile a man keeps small, the kind that stays near the corner of his mouth without fully arriving. "Ma'am, I am an electrician," he replied. "I do wires and circuits. That is about it." Evelyn glanced up at the ceiling again, watching the steady glow of the lights spread across the beams and walls of the garage. "Funny," she said softly, "because this place has been feeling darker than that broken light for a long time." Malik did not answer right away. Conversations like this were not part of the job description. Usually people like Evelyn Hayes thanked him politely, signed the invoice, and disappeared back into the large quiet house before he even reached his truck. But she had not moved toward the door. Instead, she stood there like someone who had just realized the room was quieter than she remembered. Malik stepped toward the driveway and placed the toolbox gently in the back of his pickup truck. The old Ford creaked slightly as he closed the tailgate. It was not a fancy vehicle, but the engine was strong and the seats still smelled faintly of the leather conditioner he used every few months. He turned back toward the garage, expecting Evelyn to have already gone inside. She had not. She stood near the edge of the driveway now, arms loosely folded, watching him with a calm expression that did not feel rushed or awkward. "You always explain things the way you did earlier?" she asked. Malik frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "The wiring," she said. "You explained it like it mattered. Most repairmen just say it is fixed and leave." Malik shrugged lightly. Clarity helps people trust the work. Evelyn nodded slowly, as if she appreciated that answer more than he expected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon sun dipped lower behind the oak trees lining the street, casting long shadows across the wide driveway. The light from the garage fixture behind them glowed warmer now, soft and steady, like a quiet signal in the growing evening. Evelyn broke the silence first. "Do you have time for lunch?" Malik blinked, surprised by the sudden shift. "Lunch," he repeated. "There is a cafe about 2 blocks from here," she said. "Nothing fancy. Just good sandwiches and iced tea." Malik looked back toward his truck automatically, the habit of years of work pulling his attention toward the schedule in his mind. The next job was not urgent, but there was always another house, another light fixture, another panel that needed checking before the day ended. Still, something about the way she asked made the invitation feel simple rather than complicated. He rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. "I usually keep work and personal time separate," he said honestly. Evelyn nodded as if she had expected that answer. "Fair rule," she said. Then she paused, the faintest smile returning to her lips. "But sometimes, rules are just habits that have never been questioned." Malik studied her for a moment. The woman standing in front of him did not look like someone playing games or testing boundaries. She looked like someone who had spent a long time in quiet rooms and had only recently remembered that conversation could exist outside of them. The wind stirred the leaves above the driveway, sending a soft rustle through the trees. Malik glanced back at the glowing garage light one more time. It was steady now, bright enough to fill the space without flickering. He turned back toward Evelyn slowly. "What kind of sandwiches?" he asked. Evelyn smiled fully for the first time since he had arrived, the kind of smile that felt more relieved than triumphant. "The smoked turkey club is the best thing on the menu," she said. Malik considered that for a moment. then reached into his truck and placed his toolbox back inside the cab. The decision was small. Just lunch. But as he closed the door and walked back toward the driveway, neither of them realized how unusual that afternoon would become once the quiet rules both of them had lived by started to bend. Malik Carter had expected the cafe to be crowded, but the place Evelyn Hayes led him to was smaller than he imagined, tucked between a dry cleaner and a quiet bookstore on a shaded corner 2 blocks from her street. A faded wooden sign hung above the door, and when they stepped inside, a small bell chimed softly, the sound warm and familiar like something from another decade. The room smelled of toasted bread, roasted coffee beans, and fresh lemon from the pitcher of iced tea sitting behind the counter. Malik paused near the entrance for a moment, letting his eyes adjust from the bright afternoon sun to the softer light inside. The cafe was simple, maybe 8 tables total, with sunlight streaming through tall windows that faced the street. It was the kind of place where people actually talked instead of staring at their phones. Evelyn walked to a corner table near the window, as if she had been there before, though Malik suspected she had not. She pulled out the chair across from her and nodded lightly. "I promise this is not a trap," she said with a faint smile. Malik chuckled under his breath and sat down slowly, resting his hands on the table. "I did not think it was," he replied. A young waiter approached and poured 2 glasses of iced tea before setting down menus. Malik noticed Evelyn barely glanced at hers. "The Smoked Turkey Club," she told the waiter. Then she looked across the table at Malik. "Trust me." Malik nodded politely. "I will have the same." When the waiter walked away, a quiet settled between them again, but it was not uncomfortable. Outside the window, a cyclist rolled past slowly, and a golden retriever tugged its owner along the sidewalk. The normal rhythm of the street moved on without noticing the unusual pairing sitting inside. Malik folded his hands together on the table, the faint scent of machine oil still clinging to his skin despite the rag he had used earlier. Evelyn noticed and smiled slightly. "You work with your hands every day?" she said. Malik glanced down at his palms, rougher than most people in rooms like this. "Yes," he said simply. "My mother used to say that was the most honest way to earn a living." Evelyn leaned back slightly, studying him again with that same calm curiosity. "What did she do?" Malik answered without hesitation. "She worked 2 jobs most of my childhood. Hospital kitchen during the day, cleaning offices at night." Evelyn nodded slowly, absorbing the picture forming in her mind. "And you?" she asked. Malik shrugged lightly. "Electrical apprenticeship after high school. Started my own small service company 5 years ago." Evelyn's eyebrows lifted just a little. "So you are not just the repair guy?" Malik smiled faintly. "I am exactly the repair guy. I just happen to own the business." That answer made her laugh quietly, the kind of laugh that carried relief rather than surprise. The sandwiches arrived a few minutes later, stacked high with turkey, crisp bacon, lettuce, and tomato between thick slices of toasted sourdough bread. Malik took one bite and nodded in approval. "You were right," he admitted. Evelyn smiled again, but did not answer right away. She seemed to be watching something else, something more subtle than the food or the room. Finally she spoke. "Do you know something interesting?" Malik looked up from his sandwich. "What is that?" Evelyn traced the rim of her glass slowly with her fingertip before answering. "You are the first person in months who has sat across from me without asking what I do for a living." Malik considered that. "Does that usually come up quickly?" Evelyn let out a soft breath. "Almost immediately." Malik wiped his hands with a napkin and leaned back slightly in his chair. "I figured if you wanted to tell me, you would." Evelyn studied him again for a moment before nodding. "I run an investment firm downtown," she said. "My father started it. I took it over 3 years ago." Malik nodded once. The information did not seem to change his expression at all. Evelyn noticed. "Most people react differently," she said. Malik shrugged gently. "Money is a tool," he replied. "Electricity is also a tool. Both are only useful if the person holding them knows what they are doing." Evelyn laughed again, louder this time, drawing a brief glance from the couple at the next table. She lowered her voice. "That might be the most honest answer I have heard all year." The conversation drifted after that, moving easily through small stories about neighborhoods, favorite food trucks, and the strange things people accidentally wire into their houses. Malik told her about a customer who had tried to power an entire backyard fountain using a lamp extension cord. Evelyn told him about a board meeting where two investors argued for 30 minutes about the color of a presentation slide. By the time their glasses of iced tea were empty, the afternoon sun had shifted lower across the windows, casting long rectangles of light across the wooden floor. Malik glanced at the time on the wall clock and stood slowly. "I should probably get back to work," he said. Evelyn nodded. Though there was a hint of disappointment, she did not quite hide. They walked out together into the warm, late afternoon air. Malik stopped beside his truck while Evelyn stood on the sidewalk near the curb. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Evelyn said quietly, "You know, most people who come into my life stay exactly where they started." Malik looked at her, puzzled. Evelyn continued, her voice calm but thoughtful. "But somehow you went from fixing a light to changing the entire tone of my afternoon." Malik considered that sentence carefully. Then he gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Sometimes good wiring does that," he said. Neither of them noticed the black sedan slowly rolling past the cafe at the end of the block, its driver glancing once in their direction before continuing down the quiet street. Malik Carter watched the quiet street for a moment after Evelyn Hayes finished speaking, the late afternoon sunlight stretching across the pavement in long golden lines. A soft breeze moved through the oak trees that lined the neighborhood, stirring the leaves with a gentle rustling sound that seemed to slow the entire block down. He rested one hand on the side of his old white pickup truck, the metal still warm from the sun. Something about the day had shifted in a way he did not usually allow. Workdays were normally simple equations for him. A problem, a tool, a solution. Then he moved on to the next house, the next circuit breaker, the next flickering light. But this afternoon had not followed that pattern. Evelyn stood a few feet away on the sidewalk, her arms folded lightly as if she had not yet decided whether the moment was finished or just beginning. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable, but it was thoughtful, the kind of pause people take when they sense that something slightly unusual has just happened. Malik finally broke the silence with a small nod toward the cafe door behind them. "That sandwich lived up to the promise," he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I told you." Malik opened the door of his truck and set his keys on the dashboard before leaning casually against the frame. "You said something back there," he continued, "about people staying exactly where they started." Evelyn glanced down the street before answering. "It happens more often than you might think." Malik waited. Evelyn took a slow breath, as if she was deciding how much to say. "Most people who come into my world arrive with an expectation already built," she explained. "They see the house, the business, the last name, and then the entire conversation revolves around that." Malik nodded slowly. "That must get tiring." Evelyn laughed quietly, though there was a hint of truth behind it. "It gets predictable." She looked back at him again. "You never asked about any of it." Malik shrugged lightly. "I figured you would tell me if it mattered." Evelyn studied him for a moment, the same thoughtful curiosity returning to her expression. "You are either very confident or very careful." Malik thought about that before answering. "Maybe both." The breeze shifted again, carrying the faint scent of warm pavement and fresh bread from the cafe kitchen behind them. A silver sedan passed slowly at the end of the block, its tires rolling quietly across the asphalt before disappearing around the corner. Evelyn glanced toward Malik's truck. "How long have you had that one?" Malik turned and patted the hood of the pickup gently. 8 years, he said. "Bought it used when my business was just starting. I told myself I would replace it when things got bigger." Evelyn raised an eyebrow slightly. "And did they?" Malik smiled faintly. "Yes." "So why keep the truck?" she asked. Malik looked out across the quiet street before answering. "Because it reminds me what the beginning felt like." Evelyn seemed to appreciate that answer more than she expected. She stepped a little closer to the truck, the late sunlight catching in her hair. "You know something interesting about beginnings?" she said. Malik glanced at her. "What is that?" Evelyn folded her arms again, though her voice stayed light. "Most people think they are dramatic." Malik nodded slightly. "And they are not." Evelyn shook her head gently. "Most of the time they are quiet." Malik looked at her carefully then, considering the words. The garage light at her house had flickered earlier that afternoon. Now the sun itself was beginning to dip behind the tall trees lining the street, leaving the sky painted in soft shades of amber and pale blue. He felt a strange sense that the moment carried more weight than it appeared to. Finally he straightened and reached into his truck for his toolbox. "Well," he said with a calm smile, "if this was a beginning, It was a very good sandwich. Evelyn laughed again, but this time the sound carried a warmth that felt less guarded. You are impossible, she said. Malik closed the truck door and stepped around the front bumper, preparing to leave. For a brief second, he hesitated, glancing back toward her house down the block where the garage light now glowed faintly through the open structure. If that light flickers again, he said casually, you know where to call. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. I think I will remember. Malik gave a small nod and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine started with a low rumble that echoed softly through the quiet neighborhood. As he pulled slowly away from the curb, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. Evelyn Hayes was still standing on the sidewalk watching the truck disappear down the street, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. Inside her mind a quiet realization was forming, the kind that arrives slowly but changes everything once it settles. Because for the first time in a long while, someone had stepped into her carefully ordered life without trying to rearrange it, and somehow that made the entire afternoon feel brighter than the new light now glowing in her garage. Malik Carter drove slowly through the quiet neighborhood long after Evelyn Hayes had disappeared from the rearview mirror. The soft rumble of the pickup truck filled the cab, steady and familiar, the kind of sound that usually helped him clear his thoughts between jobs. But today the road felt different. The late afternoon sun stretched across the windshield in long golden streaks, and the calm suburban streets rolled past like pages turning too slowly for his mind to keep up. He tapped the steering wheel lightly with his fingers as he approached a stop sign, the faint smell of toasted bread from the cafe still lingering in his memory. Lunch had not been part of the plan. Neither had the conversation that followed, and definitely not the strange sense that something in his routine had shifted by a few degrees, just enough to make the rest of the day feel slightly unfamiliar. Malik turned onto the main road leading back toward the commercial district where most of his service calls waited. Traffic moved steadily now, the usual afternoon rhythm of delivery vans, construction trucks, and commuters heading home. For a few minutes, he let the engine and the road pull him back into the ordinary pattern of work. There was another job scheduled across town, a small office building with a hallway light that had been flickering for 3 days. Simple job. Replace ballast. Check the wiring. Finish before sunset. Still, the quiet calm from the lunch table kept slipping back into his thoughts. The way Evelyn had listened when he spoke. The way she had laughed without trying to fill the silence. The way she had stood on the sidewalk watching his truck disappear like the moment had meant something beyond a simple repair call. Malik shook his head lightly and pulled into a small hardware supply store parking lot. He stepped out of the truck and walked inside, the familiar smell of metal, lumber, and electrical insulation greeting him like an old friend. The clerk behind the counter nodded as he grabbed a replacement fixture and a small box of connectors. Busy day? The man asked casually. Malik gave a small shrug. Normal day. But even as he said it, the words felt slightly less certain than usual. 15 minutes later, he was back on the road again, the sky beginning to soften into early evening colors. When he reached the office building downtown, the job went exactly as expected. Ladder up. Panel open. Loose connection replaced. Within 20 minutes, the hallway lights hummed steadily back to life. The building manager thanked him quickly before returning to a phone call. Malik packed his tools and walked back to the truck as the sun dipped lower behind the city skyline. For a moment, he leaned against the door and looked up at the glowing windows above him. Work was work. Reliable. Predictable. That was how he liked it. And yet the quiet rhythm of the day still felt slightly out of tune. Across town, Evelyn Hayes stood in her garage again as evening settled around the neighborhood. The new light above her glowed steadily, filling the space with a warm brightness that felt almost symbolic after weeks of flickering. She had walked back from the cafe slowly, replaying the conversation in her mind more than once. The house behind her was large and silent as usual, the long hallways and tall windows holding the kind of quiet that money could not solve. But something about the afternoon had shifted the atmosphere just enough to make the silence feel less heavy. She stepped farther into the garage and looked up at the fixture Malik had installed. The wiring was neat, the screws perfectly aligned. It was the kind of careful work that reflected the person who had done it. Evelyn folded her arms and leaned lightly against the wall. Most people who passed through her world came with visible expectations. Investors, lawyers, consultants, board members. Conversations with them always followed the same patterns. Polished introductions, strategic questions, calculated answers. But Malik Carter had not asked for anything. Not her position, not her company, not her influence. The realization lingered in her mind. As she turned off the garage light and watched the evening shadows settle into the quiet space. Upstairs, the house felt exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet something inside her perspective had shifted slightly, the way sunlight changes the tone of a room even when nothing else moves. She walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water, staring out through the tall windows toward the street beyond the trees. The neighborhood was peaceful at this hour, porch lights beginning to flicker on one by one as families returned home from work and school. Somewhere in the distance a car door shut, and a dog barked briefly before the sound faded again. Evelyn rested her hand against the kitchen counter and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. It had been a simple afternoon. A repaired light. A sandwich at a quiet cafe. A conversation with a man who spoke with calm honesty instead of practiced ambition. Yet for reasons she could not fully explain, the memory of that lunch carried more weight than most meetings she had attended all year. And as evening settled across the quiet street outside, Evelyn Hayes realized something else quietly forming in the back of her mind. The number for Malik Carter's service company was still saved in her phone, and for the first time since taking over her father's firm, she found herself wondering whether the next call she made would actually have nothing to do with a broken light at all. The next morning arrived quietly over the city, the pale light of early sun sliding between tall buildings and across the windshield of Malik Carter's pickup truck as he parked outside a small neighborhood grocery store. The air carried the crisp smell of fresh bread and cool pavement, the kind of calm morning that usually helped him settle into the rhythm of another workday. Malik stepped out of the truck and stretched his shoulders, the familiar weight of his tool bag resting comfortably against his side. He had 3 service calls scheduled before noon and another 2 across town later in the afternoon. It was the kind of steady workload that kept his business running and his mind focused. Still, as he locked the truck and walked toward the entrance of the store to grab a cup of coffee, his thoughts drifted briefly back to the afternoon before. The lunch at the small cafe had felt unexpectedly easy. No awkward tension, no long explanations. Just conversation that moved naturally from one topic to another like 2 people who had met in the middle of a quiet street, instead of from opposite ends of very different worlds. Malik pushed open the door of the grocery store and nodded politely to the cashier behind the counter. He grabbed a hot coffee from the self-serve machine and stepped back outside, leaning against the truck while the steam curled slowly into the cool air. For a moment, he let the morning silence settle around him. Across the parking lot, a delivery truck backed into a loading dock while 2 workers unloaded crates of produce. The sound of wooden pallets sliding across concrete echoed faintly, grounding him in the familiar rhythm of everyday work. He took a slow sip of coffee and reminded himself that the day before had simply been a pleasant conversation with a customer. Nothing more. Life worked better when things stayed simple. Across town, however, the morning unfolded differently inside the tall glass office building where Evelyn Hayes spent most of her weekdays. The elevator doors opened onto the 22nd floor, and she stepped out into the quiet hallway of her investment firm. The office was already active despite the early hour. Phones rang softly in distant rooms, keyboards clicked in steady rhythm, and the faint murmur of financial news played from a television mounted near the reception desk. Evelyn walked past rows of glass offices toward her own corner workspace overlooking the river. Normally, she moved through the building with practiced efficiency, already thinking 3 meetings ahead before she even sat down. But today her pace was slower. She placed her bag on the desk and looked out through the tall windows at the sunlight reflecting across the water far below. Something about the previous afternoon still lingered in her thoughts. The simplicity of it. The unexpected honesty in Malik Carter's voice when he spoke about his work and his mother and the beginnings of his business. Evelyn had spent years surrounded by conversations that sounded polished and impressive, yet often felt strangely empty. Yet a man who fixed electrical wiring had somehow managed to make a simple lunch feel more genuine than most boardroom discussions she attended all week. She sat down in her chair and opened her laptop, though her eyes drifted toward her phone resting beside it on the desk. Malik's contact number remained saved there from the service invoice. The name looked ordinary against the screen. just a local electrician. But the memory behind it carried a different weight. Evelyn shook her head lightly and turned her attention back to the stack of documents waiting for her review. Markets opened in less than an hour, and several large investment decisions required her approval before the afternoon. Responsibility had a way of pushing personal thoughts aside. Meanwhile, Malik finished his coffee and climbed back into his truck. The engine rumbled to life as he pulled onto the street and headed toward his first service call of the morning. The radio played quietly through the speakers, a local news station discussing traffic updates and weather forecasts. Clouds were expected later in the afternoon, but the morning sky remained clear and bright. Malik drove through several familiar neighborhoods until he reached a small brick house where an elderly couple waited on the front porch. The problem turned out to be a simple outdoor outlet that had stopped working after a recent rainstorm. 20 minutes later, the outlet was repaired, and the couple thanked him warmly before returning inside. As Malik packed his tools and stepped back toward the truck, he felt the comfortable satisfaction of another small problem solved. Work like this grounded him. It reminded him that progress often came one careful repair at a time. Still, as he started the engine again and checked the schedule for the next job, a quiet thought slipped through his mind. Somewhere across the city, a garage light he had installed the day before was glowing steadily in a large quiet house. And for reasons he could not quite explain, the memory of that warm light and the woman who stood beneath it continued to follow him through the steady rhythm of the morning. The afternoon sun had climbed higher by the time Malik Carter finished his third service call of the day. The sky above the city was a clear pale blue, the kind that made the buildings shine like polished steel and glass. Malik stood beside his pickup truck in a quiet parking lot, tightening the lid on his toolbox before placing it carefully in the truck bed. The job had been simple. Replace a faulty switch, test the circuit, restore the lights. Work like that usually left him with a steady sense of completion. The quiet satisfaction of knowing a small part of someone's day would now run more smoothly. Yet as he closed the tailgate and wiped his hands with the familiar cotton rag from his belt, his thoughts drifted again to the same place they had wandered more than once since morning. The house with the oak trees, the garage with the warm new light, and the calm voice of Evelyn Hayes asking questions that felt more thoughtful than most conversations he had during an entire week of service calls. Malik shook his head slightly and climbed into the truck. He turned the key and the engine rumbled awake beneath him. The radio clicked on automatically, filling the cab with a low murmur of traffic updates and midday news. Outside the windshield, the parking lot shimmered under the bright sunlight, a few scattered cars resting quietly between painted lines. Malik pulled onto the street and merged into the steady flow of afternoon traffic. Work had always been the one place where his focus stayed clear, one problem at a time, one repair after another. But today the rhythm felt slightly off balance, like a guitar string tuned just a fraction too tight. Across town, the 22nd floor of Hayes Capital moved through the controlled energy of another busy afternoon. Analysts moved between desks carrying reports, assistants coordinated meetings in quiet tones, and computer screens flickered with numbers tracking markets across the world. Evelyn Hayes sat at the head of a long conference table, listening as two senior advisors explained the potential risks of an international investment deal. Normally, she would follow every detail with careful attention, asking precise questions before making a decision. Today she still listened, but part of her mind remained somewhere else. The previous afternoon had left a quiet impression she could not easily ignore. Malik Carter had spoken with the calm confidence of someone who built things with his own hands. No rehearsed lines. No careful attempts to impress her. Just simple honesty. The meeting continued around her for nearly an hour before the discussion finally wrapped up. Her advisors gathered their papers and left the room, the door closing softly behind them. The large conference space fell silent. Evelyn remained seated for a moment, staring at the city skyline through the tall windows. The sunlight reflected off the glass towers outside, turning the view into a shifting mosaic of light. She reached for her phone without thinking and glanced at the contact list. Malik Carter Electrical Services. The name sat quietly on the screen, unchanged since the service invoice the day before. She placed the phone back on the table and exhaled slowly. It would be easy to call. There were always reasons to request additional work around a house that large. But the idea lingered there for a different reason now. Meanwhile, Malik slowed his truck at a red light near the edge of downtown. The traffic signal glowed bright against the afternoon sky, while cars lined up patiently in both directions. He rested one hand on the steering wheel and glanced at the dashboard clock. There was enough time for one more job before evening. The phone mounted near the dash buzzed suddenly with a new notification. Malik glanced down briefly at the screen when the light turned green and the truck began to roll forward again. A message had arrived from a number he recognized immediately, even though he had only seen it once before. He pulled into a nearby parking space and stopped the truck before picking up the phone. The message was simple. "Hello, Malik. I hope your day is going well. I noticed something unusual with the lighting in another part of the house. When you have time, I would appreciate your advice. Evelyn Hayes." Malik read the message twice before lowering the phone slightly. Outside the windshield, the afternoon traffic continued to move through the city, unaware that a small decision was quietly forming inside the cab of an old white pickup truck. Malik leaned back in the seat and looked through the glass at the sky above the buildings. The job might be real, or it might simply be another conversation waiting to happen. Either way, the steady rhythm of his ordinary workday had just shifted again, one small message at a time. Malik Carter sat in the driver's seat of his pickup truck for several seconds after reading the message from Evelyn Hayes. Outside the windshield, the afternoon traffic continued to slide past in steady motion, sunlight glinting off passing windshields and glass storefronts along the street. The world was moving the same way it always did. But inside the cab, the moment felt strangely paused. Malik read the message again, slower this time. The words were polite, professional, the kind of request a homeowner might send to any contractor after noticing another issue in the house. Still, something about the tone felt familiar in a different way. He rested his elbow on the door and looked out toward the sidewalk where a few pedestrians walked past a small bakery, carrying paper bags and cups of coffee. It would be easy to answer with a simple reply. Schedule the visit. Check the wiring. Finish the work. That was the pattern he followed every day. Yet the quiet memory of their lunch conversation made the decision feel slightly different from an ordinary service call. Malik finally picked up the phone again and typed a response slowly. "Hello, Evelyn. I have one more job to finish this afternoon. After that, I can stop by and take a look if you would like." He read the message once more before pressing send. The small blue check mark appeared on the screen a few seconds later. Malik set the phone back into the holder near the dashboard and started the truck again. The engine rumbled beneath him as he pulled away from the curb and headed toward his final appointment of the day. Across town, Evelyn Hayes was standing near the large windows of her office when the notification appeared on her phone. The skyline stretched beyond the glass like a field of steel and sunlight, but her attention shifted immediately to the message on the screen. She read Malik's reply once, then again, and felt a small wave of relief that surprised even her. She had told herself the message was about the lighting issue in the upstairs hallway, which technically was true. The fixture there had flickered once the night before. But the reason she had reached for her phone earlier that afternoon had carried another quiet layer beneath the practical explanation. She typed her response carefully. "That would be perfect. Thank you. I will be home after 5:30. She paused for a moment before adding one more line. "And I promise this one really does involve a light." Evelyn smiled faintly as she pressed send. The humor was small, but it reminded her of the easy conversation they had shared the day before. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly as meetings and reports filled the remaining hours. By the time the elevator doors opened in the lobby and Evelyn stepped outside, the sky above the city had begun shifting toward evening colors. The drive home took nearly 20 minutes through quiet residential streets lined with tall trees and well-kept lawns. When she pulled into the driveway of her house, the first porch lights along the street were already beginning to glow softly against the fading daylight. Evelyn stepped out of the car and walked toward the garage, pausing for a moment beneath the warm light Malik had installed the previous afternoon. The fixture hummed gently above her, steady and bright. Inside the house, the hallway light she had mentioned flickered once, exactly as she remembered. It was a small problem, a simple repair for someone with the right tools. She placed her bag on the kitchen counter and glanced toward the clock above the stove. 5:22. Outside, the sky continued to darken slowly while the quiet neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm. A few houses down the street, someone started a grill, the faint scent of charcoal drifting through the air. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once before falling silent again. Evelyn walked back toward the garage and stood near the open door for a moment, listening to the peaceful sounds of the street. The same quiet place where Malik Carter had stood the day before tightening the last screw into the new fixture. Meanwhile, across town, Malik finished his final service call just as the sun dipped below the horizon. He packed his tools into the truck and checked the time on the dashboard clock. 5:17. The drive to Evelyn's neighborhood would take about 15 minutes if traffic stayed light. Malik pulled onto the road and headed toward the quiet residential streets lined with oak trees and long driveways. As he turned onto Evelyn's block, the sky above the neighborhood had softened into shades of deep blue and fading gold. Porch lights glowed warmly along the sidewalks, and the evening air carried the calm stillness that comes just before night fully settles. Malik slowed the truck as the familiar house came into view at the end of the driveway. The garage door was open again, the warm light he had installed glowing clearly against the dimming sky. Evelyn Hayes stood near the entrance just inside the garage, her silhouette framed by the steady glow of the fixture above her. For a brief second, Malik sat quietly in the truck before turning off the engine. The steady hum faded into the calm evening air. He stepped out and closed the door gently, the sound echoing softly against the quiet street. As he walked toward the garage, the same warm light from the day before spilled across the driveway, and the moment felt strangely familiar, as if the story that had started with a simple repair had quietly continued exactly where it had left off. Malik Carter stepped into the warm circle of light spilling from the garage, the soft glow from the fixture above casting gentle shadows across the concrete floor. The evening air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of fresh grass and distant charcoal grills from somewhere down the quiet street. Evelyn Hayes stood a few steps inside the garage with her arms loosely folded, the same calm expression on her face that he remembered from the afternoon before. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, and the stillness felt less like awkward silence, and more like two people noticing the same quiet detail at the same time. Malik gave a small nod as he approached. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady. Evelyn returned the nod with a faint smile. "Thank you for coming back." Malik glanced up toward the bright garage light above them, then toward the open doorway leading into the house. "You mentioned another light was acting up," he said. Evelyn turned and gestured toward the hallway inside. "Upstairs," she replied. "It flickered last night. I figured I should have it checked before it becomes a real problem." Malik stepped inside and followed her through the quiet house. The interior carried the same spacious calm he remembered, polished wood floors stretching down a long hallway, while soft lamps glowed in corners of the large rooms. The place was elegant but quiet, like a house that had been built for a full family, but currently held only one set of footsteps. Evelyn led him up the staircase and stopped beneath a ceiling fixture halfway down the upper hallway. The light flickered once as if on cue before settling again into a steady glow. Malik set his tool bag down and looked up at the fixture. "Could be a loose connection," he said thoughtfully. He reached for a small step ladder leaning against the hallway wall, unfolding it with practiced ease before climbing up a few steps. The screwdriver moved carefully in his hand as he removed the glass cover and checked the wiring inside. Evelyn stood a few feet away watching quietly, the soft hallway light reflecting against the framed artwork along the walls. After a minute, Malik tightened a small connector and tested the switch. The light hummed steadily without flickering. He replaced the cover and stepped down from the ladder. "That should do it," he said. Evelyn glanced up at the fixture, waiting a moment before nodding with quiet satisfaction. "You make it look easy." Malik closed the ladder and rested it against the wall again. "Electricity usually behaves once you listen to what it is trying to tell you." Evelyn smiled slightly at that answer. "You say that like it applies to more than wiring." Malik shrugged gently and lifted his tool bag. "Sometimes it does." They walked back down the staircase together, the quiet sound of their footsteps echoing softly through the large house. When they reached the garage again, the sky outside had deepened into a darker shade of evening blue. The warm light above the garage still glowed steadily, illuminating the driveway and the oak trees beyond. Evelyn paused near the doorway as Malik set his tools down beside the truck. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "most people who come here fix something and leave as quickly as possible." Malik leaned lightly against the side of the truck. "That is usually the safest way to do the job. Evelyn studied him for a moment before asking the question that had quietly been forming in her mind since the afternoon before. Safe for who? Malik considered that. The street behind her was calm, the neighborhood settling into its evening rhythm while porch lights flickered on one by one along the block. Finally, he answered with a small thoughtful smile. Probably for everyone. Evelyn nodded slowly, though her eyes suggested she understood more of the meaning than the words alone carried. She glanced toward the cafe down the street, even though it was too far away to see from there. You never answered something yesterday, she said. Malik raised an eyebrow slightly. What was that? Evelyn folded her arms again and leaned lightly against the doorframe. Whether you ever break your own rules. Malik looked at the warm light glowing above the garage for a moment before turning his attention back to her. The evening breeze moved softly through the trees lining the driveway, carrying the quiet sounds of the neighborhood settling into night. Sometimes, he admitted. Evelyn's expression softened slightly at the answer. The moment stretched quietly between them again, the same kind of thoughtful pause that had followed their first conversation in this very garage. And for the second time in 2 days, the light above them shone steadily, while something less visible continued to shift slowly between two people who had not expected to meet twice in the same place. The evening air had grown cooler by the time the quiet pause between them finally broke. Malik Carter lifted his tool bag and set it in the back of his pickup truck, the metal clasps clicking softly as he closed it. The warm garage light above them cast a steady glow across the driveway, turning the concrete a pale gold against the deepening blue sky. Evelyn Hayes remained near the doorway, watching him with the same thoughtful expression that had followed much of their conversation that evening. The neighborhood had settled into its night rhythm now. Porch lights glowed along the street. A distant television murmured through an open window somewhere down the block, and the leaves of the tall oak trees rustled gently in the breeze. Malik rested one hand against the side of the truck and looked back toward the house. That hallway light should stay steady now, he said calmly. Evelyn nodded, glancing briefly toward the interior of the house before returning her attention to him. You always sound so certain when you say that. Malik smiled slightly. Electric problems usually come down to something small. A loose wire. A worn connection. Once you find the right point, everything else falls into place. Evelyn stepped a little closer into the light. That is an interesting way to describe things. Malik raised an eyebrow. Why is that? Evelyn folded her arms lightly. Because the way you talk about wiring sounds a lot like the way people talk about life. Malik chuckled softly and shook his head. Life is a lot less predictable than electrical circuits. Evelyn studied his face for a moment as if weighing that. Answer. The warm light above them reflected faintly in her eyes. Maybe, she said quietly. But sometimes people just need the right connection tightened. The words hung in the air between them for a second longer than either expected. Malik glanced down at the pavement, considering the thought before looking back at her. You should probably get some rest, he said gently. Long day at work. Evelyn laughed softly. You noticed that? Malik shrugged. Most people who run a company look tired by evening. Evelyn leaned lightly against the doorframe of the garage. And electricians do not. Malik shook his head. Electricians just fix things until they stop flickering. That answer made her smile again. The quiet humor between them had become a familiar rhythm over the past 2 days. For a moment neither of them spoke, simply standing in the soft pool of light while the street beyond remained calm and still. Finally Evelyn glanced toward the truck. You probably have more jobs tomorrow. Malik nodded. Always do. Evelyn hesitated slightly before speaking again. Do you ever take time off? Malik thought about that question as he reached into the truck and pulled out a small cloth to wipe his hands. Not often, he admitted. Starting a business keeps you busy. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. My father used to say the same thing about running an investment firm. Malik closed the truck door and stepped back toward the driveway. Sounds like he understood hard work. Evelyn looked toward the dark windows of the house behind her. He understood work very well, she said quietly. Understanding people was harder for him. Malik did not reply immediately. The tone in her voice carried something more personal than the earlier conversation. Instead, he leaned against the truck again and waited. Evelyn noticed the pause and gave a small, reassuring smile. Do not worry. That story takes longer than one evening. Malik returned the smile gently. I have learned patience fixing old wiring. Some things take time. The breeze moved softly through the trees again, brushing cool air across the driveway. The moment felt strangely comfortable despite how little they truly knew about each other. Evelyn looked up at the glowing light above them once more. "You know something strange?" she said. Malik glanced up at the fixture as well. "What is that?" Evelyn spoke slowly, as if the thought had only just formed. "This garage used to feel darker even when the lights were on." Malik followed her gaze to the ceiling fixture and nodded. "That happens sometimes." Evelyn turned back to him. "But now it feels different." Malik considered that statement carefully before answering. Maybe the wiring was not the only thing that needed adjusting. Evelyn laughed quietly at the remark. "You see what I mean?" Malik smiled again, but did not reply. Instead, he reached for the truck door and opened it, preparing to leave. Before climbing in, he paused and looked back at her one last time. The garage light framed her figure softly against the darker interior of the house. "If anything else starts flickering," he said calmly, "you know where to find me." Evelyn nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I have a feeling I will remember." Malik stepped into the truck and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the driveway as he backed slowly toward the street. In the rearview mirror, he saw Evelyn still standing beneath the warm garage light, watching the truck disappear down the quiet road just as she had the evening before. And though neither of them said it aloud, both understood that what had begun as a simple repair had quietly turned into something neither of them expected to find when the first light flickered on. The quiet street had already settled into full night by the time Malik Carter's pickup truck disappeared around the corner. The steady glow of porch lights stretched down the block like small beacons guiding families home, and the tall oak trees lining the sidewalk swayed gently in the cool evening breeze. Evelyn Hayes remained standing beneath the garage light for a few moments longer, watching the empty road where the truck had vanished. The warm light above her hummed softly, steady and dependable, casting long shadows across the driveway. She folded her arms loosely and glanced up at the fixture again, the same one Malik had installed only 2 days earlier. For weeks that space had flickered with uncertain light, a small irritation that had quietly followed her every time she entered or left the house. Now the glow was constant, calm, and strangely comforting. Evelyn exhaled slowly before turning back toward the house. Inside, the hallway lamps cast gentle pools of light along the polished wood floor, illuminating framed photographs and quiet corners that rarely saw visitors. The house was large enough to hold a family, yet most nights it felt more like a carefully arranged museum of quiet rooms. Evelyn walked into the kitchen and set a glass of water on the counter before glancing again at the clock on the wall. The evening had passed more quickly than she expected. Her mind drifted back to the conversation in the garage, the way Malik Carter spoke about wiring as if every small connection mattered. The thought lingered as she leaned lightly against the counter. Across town, Malik drove through the calm residential streets toward his small apartment above a neighborhood barber shop. The truck headlights cut softly through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead, while the radio played a low stream of evening news. He rested one hand on the steering wheel, the quiet rhythm of the drive helping him sort through the thoughts that had followed him since leaving Evelyn's house. For a man who spent most of his days solving practical problems with tools and wiring, the past 2 evenings had introduced a different kind of puzzle. The conversation had been simple, honest, yet something about the quiet understanding between them had left a deeper impression than he expected. Malik slowed the truck as he turned onto the narrow street where his apartment building stood. The brick storefront below was already closed for the night, the barber's striped pole dark and still beside the entrance. He parked along the curb and turned off the engine, the sudden silence settling around him like a pause in the middle of a long sentence. For a moment he remained seated, looking out at the quiet sidewalk beneath the street lamp. He had built his life around steady routines. Work hard. Keep things simple. Do not complicate a system that already functions. Yet something about the last 2 days felt like a circuit that had unexpectedly connected in a place he had not planned. Malik finally stepped out of the truck and locked the door before climbing the narrow staircase to his apartment. The small space inside was neat and practical, a modest living room with a couch, a kitchen table, and a row of tools neatly arranged along one wall. He placed his keys on the counter and walked toward the window overlooking the street. The same calm silence stretched across the neighborhood below. Meanwhile, Evelyn Hayes stood in the upstairs hallway of her house, looking up at the ceiling fixture Malik had repaired earlier that evening. The light remained steady now, bright enough to fill the hallway without flickering. She switched it off once, then on again, just to be certain. The glow returned immediately, smooth and reliable. Evelyn smiled faintly to herself before walking toward the staircase. The house felt slightly different tonight. Not dramatically changed, but subtly lighter, as if the quiet spaces between the rooms carried less weight than before. She paused halfway down the stairs and glanced toward the garage door at the end of the hallway. Through the small window, she could see the warm light still shining outside. For reasons she could not fully explain, the image reminded her of something important. Not the repair itself, but the simple calm presence of the man who had fixed it. Back across the city, Malik leaned against the window frame of his apartment and looked out at the streetlight below. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sliding briefly across the pavement before fading into the distance. He reached for a glass of water on the kitchen counter and took a slow sip before setting it down again. His phone rested beside it, the screen dark and silent. He knew the practical thing to do was let the moment remain what it had been. A job completed, a conversation shared. Nothing more complicated than that. Yet as he stood there watching the quiet street, the memory of Evelyn's thoughtful smile beneath the garage light returned once more. Somewhere across the city, that same warm light was still glowing steadily above her driveway. And though neither of them realized it yet, the connection that had quietly formed between two different worlds was only beginning to reveal what it might become. Morning arrived slowly over the city, the pale gray light of dawn slipping between buildings and rooftops as Malik Carter stood at the small kitchen counter of his apartment. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, rising gently from a simple mug beside the sink. Outside the window, the street below was still quiet. Only a few early commuters walking along the sidewalk, while delivery trucks rumbled through the intersection at the end of the block. Malik leaned against the counter and watched the morning unfold. The calm silence felt familiar, yet his thoughts were not entirely focused on the new workday ahead. The image of Evelyn Hayes standing beneath the warm garage light returned to his mind once again, the steady glow framing her thoughtful expression the way it had the night before. Malik took a slow sip of coffee and set the mug down. He had built his life around discipline and routine, the kind that kept everything balanced and predictable. But sometimes a small moment had the ability to shift a routine in ways that could not be ignored. Across the city, Evelyn Hayes woke to the soft sound of morning light filtering through the tall windows of her bedroom. The quiet house greeted her the same way it always did, still and spacious, the kind of calm that usually came with living alone in a place designed for many more voices. She stepped into the hallway and paused beneath the ceiling fixture Malik had repaired the evening before. The light switched on instantly when she pressed the button, steady and bright. Evelyn smiled faintly before walking down the stairs. In the kitchen, she poured herself a cup of coffee and moved toward the large window overlooking the street. The neighborhood was just beginning to wake up. A jogger passed along the sidewalk, a school bus turned the corner slowly, and the sunlight brushed gently across the rooftops of the surrounding houses. Evelyn wrapped both hands around the warm mug and leaned lightly against the counter. For a moment, she allowed herself to think about the past 2 days without the distractions of meetings or phone calls. Malik Carter had walked into her life through the simple task of repairing a light fixture, yet his presence had introduced a sense of calm honesty she had not experienced in a long time. The memory of their conversations replayed quietly in her mind. The way he explained electrical wiring as if every small detail mattered. The way he spoke about his mother and his business with steady pride instead of boasting. Most of all, she remembered the ease of their silence. Not every moment between two people needed to be filled with words. Meanwhile, Malik finished his coffee and reached for the keys resting beside the door. The morning sun had grown brighter outside, lighting the narrow street below with a soft golden glow. As he stepped outside and walked down the staircase toward his truck, he noticed the quiet energy of the neighborhood coming to life. A man opened the barbershop door downstairs while a delivery driver carried boxes toward the grocery store on the corner. Malik unlocked the truck and climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine as the radio quietly came to life. Today would bring another list of repairs and service calls, another series of homes and offices where lights flickered or circuits needed attention. Yet as he drove toward the main road, he could not completely dismiss the quiet curiosity forming in the back of his mind. Somewhere across the city, a woman he had met only 2 days earlier might be starting her morning with the same thoughts. Back at the large house beneath the oak trees, Evelyn finished her coffee and placed the mug gently into the sink. Her phone rested on the kitchen counter beside a stack of papers from the office. She picked it up and looked at the contact list for a moment before opening a new message. The name Malik Carter appeared on the screen. She hesitated briefly, considering the words before typing slowly. Good morning, Malik. I hope your day is starting well. I wanted to thank you again for fixing the lights. Everything looks perfect today. She paused with her thumb resting above the send button. The message was simple, polite, and technically unnecessary. Yet something about it felt important in a way she could not quite explain. After a moment, she pressed send. The phone returned to the quiet screen of the contact list as she set it back down on the counter. Across the city, Malik had just stopped at a traffic light when his phone vibrated softly against the dashboard holder. He glanced down briefly and noticed the new message waiting on the screen. The light turned green and the truck rolled forward with the flow of morning traffic. But the small notification remained there quietly, glowing beneath the sunlight streaming through the windshield. For reasons neither of them fully understood yet, the connection between a simple electrician and a woman who managed an entire investment firm had begun to move beyond the ordinary boundaries of a repair call. And somewhere between the steady hum of electricity and the quiet honesty of two conversations, something new had started to take shape. The city moved into the quiet rhythm of mid-morning traffic as Malik Carter's pickup truck rolled steadily along the wide avenue, leading toward his next service call. Sunlight reflected off the windshields of passing cars and spilled across the dashboard, warming the inside of the cab. The phone mounted beside the steering wheel still displayed the message Evelyn Hayes had sent a few minutes earlier. Malik glanced at it again when the truck stopped at another traffic light. Good morning, Malik. I hope your day is starting well. I wanted to thank you again for fixing the lights. Everything looks perfect today. The message was simple, but something about it felt genuine in a way that most morning messages rarely did. Malik read it once more before allowing a small, thoughtful smile to form. He picked up the phone and typed a reply while the traffic around him waited quietly at the red light. Good morning, Evelyn. I am glad everything is working the way it should. Sometimes a small adjustment is all it takes to keep things running smoothly. He paused for a moment before adding one more line. I hope your day goes well too. The light turned green just as he pressed send, and the truck moved forward again with the flow of traffic. Across the city, Evelyn Hayes stood near the tall windows of her office overlooking the river when the reply appeared on her screen. She read the message slowly, noticing the calm tone that had already become familiar. A small adjustment. The phrase stayed in her thoughts for a moment longer than expected. Evelyn set the phone down on the desk and looked out toward the skyline where sunlight shimmered across the water. The morning meetings had not started yet, and the office was unusually quiet for that time of day. She leaned back slightly in her chair and allowed herself to reflect on the past few days. What had begun as a simple repair request had turned into something far more meaningful than she anticipated. Malik Carter had not arrived in her life through business connections or social introductions. He had simply walked into her garage carrying a toolbox and an honest willingness to fix a problem. Yet in doing so, he had brought a kind of clarity she had not realized she needed. Meanwhile, Malik turned the truck into a small residential street where his next job waited. The house at the end of the driveway belonged to a young family who had reported a faulty kitchen outlet. He parked beside the curb and stepped out, gathering his tools before walking toward the front door. The work itself would take less than 30 minutes. Still, as he knocked on the door and waited for someone to answer, his mind briefly returned to the warm garage light shining above Evelyn's driveway the night before. Some connections were simple. Others required time before their purpose became clear. By the time Malik finished the repair and returned to his truck, the late morning sun had climbed higher into the sky. The day continued the way workdays always did. One repair, then another. Yet something about the steady rhythm felt different now. Not disrupted, but quietly expanded. Later that afternoon, Evelyn left her office earlier than usual. The drive home took her through the familiar tree-lined streets where the city gradually gave way to quiet residential neighborhoods. When she turned into her driveway, the garage light was already glowing softly against the approaching evening. She stepped out of the car and paused for a moment beneath the fixture Malik had installed days earlier. The light was still steady, still warm. She looked up at it and smiled faintly, remembering the first moment he had climbed down from the ladder and heard her unexpected compliment. "You are handsome, you know that." The memory felt almost distant now, yet it had started something neither of them had planned. Evelyn walked inside the garage and switched off the light briefly before turning it back on again. The glow returned immediately, just as reliable as before. Somewhere across the city, Malik Carter was finishing another service call, unaware that the simple act of fixing one garage light had quietly altered the direction of two lives moving through very different worlds. And although neither of them spoke about it yet, both understood something important in the quiet space between their messages and conversations. Sometimes a single moment of honesty is enough to illuminate everything that follows. Just like a light that finally stops flickering once the right connection is made.